You busy? It's Mr. Creighton.
Hey gang, it's Mrs. Klein.
All right, guys, welcome to the second podcast for Lesson 2, the development of feudalism in Western Europe. Just a reminder, the guiding question we'll be looking at, how well did feudalism establish order in Europe in the Middle Ages?
Okay. We also have some vocabulary terms again, you guys. We heard some of them in the first podcast. You're going to hear some others in this podcast. The vocabulary terms are Charlemagne, chivalry, Christianity, feudalism, fief, and serf.
All right, so starting off, Section 4, Lords and Ladies during feudal times. Like monarchs, lords and ladies were members of the nobility, which is the highest ranking class in medieval society. Most of them lived on manors.
The manor house was the center of the community, and in times of trouble, villagers entered its walls for protection. Kings and queens, high-ranking nobles, and wealthy lords lived in even grander structures, castles. Castles were built for many purposes, but one of their main functions was to serve as a home. Castles were also one of the most important forms of military technology. With their moats, strong walls, and gates, they were built for defense.
All right, the next smaller section is the responsibilities in daily life of lords and ladies. It was the lord's responsibility to manage and defend his land and its laborers. Lords also acted as judges in manor courts and had the power to fine and punish those who broke the law. In times of war, lords fought for their own higher-ranking lords, or at least supplied them with a well-trained fighting force.
In theory, only men were part of the feudal relationship between lord and vassal. However, it was quite common in the Middle Ages for noble women to hold fiefs and inherit land. So actually, ladies had some rights, which is kind of nice. Ladies were also responsible for overseeing their household or households.
Although nobles and monarchs had the most privileged lives in medieval times, they were not always easy or comfortable by modern standards. Fleas and lice infected all medieval buildings, and people generally bathed only once a week, if that.
Ew.
Smells like my classroom.
Yep.
Clothes were not washed daily either. Diseases affected the rich as well as the poor.
Dang, I don't know, man. That's not, I mean, I'm a noble, but...
It still sounds pretty terrible.
Still sounds pretty terrible. All right, now we're going to find out a little bit about knights during feudal times, you guys. Okay, knights were the mounted soldiers of the medieval world. Knights were usually vassals of more powerful lords.
All right, becoming a knight. The path to becoming a knight involved many years of training. A boy started as a page or servant. At the age of 7, he left his home and went to live in the castle of a lord who was often a relative.
Wow, 7, that's pretty young.
That's really young.
Okay, after about 7 years as a page, a young boy became a squire. During this part of his training, he spent most of his time with the knight who was his lord.
Most importantly, squires trained to become warriors. They learned how to fight with a sword and a lance, a kind of spear that measured up to 15 feet long. In his early 20s, if deserving of the honor, a squire became a knight, a process that at times was a complex religious event.
Right, so think about it, you guys. You're about that age of, like, you would have been training for 7 years in order to be a knight by how old you are about right now, right? They would have become squires at about this time. All right, the responsibilities and daily life of knights. Being a knight was more than a profession. It was a way of life. Knights lived by a strong code of behavior called chivalry. Knights were expected to be loyal to the church and to their lord, to be just and fair, and to protect the helpless.
Jousts and tournaments were a major part of a knight's life. In a joust, 2 armored knights on horseback galloped at each other with their lances extended, aiming to unseat their opponent from his horse.
Knights fought wearing heavy suits of armor as well. The medieval style of knighthood lasted, you guys, until about the 17th century, when warfare changed with the growing use of gunpowder and cannons. All right, next, we're going to turn to the daily life for the vast majority of the population, you guys, the peasants. Very few of us would have been in the noble class.
So just historically speaking, the majority of the population in any civilization is typically the peasants.
It's at the bottom.
All right, so learning about the peasants. Peasants during feudal times. Most people during the Middle Ages were peasants. They supported the entire feudal structure by working the land, so they're pretty much farmers. Their labor freed lords and knights to spend their time preparing for war or for fighting.
Free peasants rented land to farm and owed only their rent to the lord. Unfree peasants, or serfs, farmed the lord's fields and could not leave their lord's manor, right? They were tied to the land.
Yeah.
Most peasants raised crops and tended livestock, farm animals. But every manor also had carpenters, shoemakers, smiths or metal workers, and other skilled workers.
Along with the work they performed, peasants and serfs might owe the lord numerous taxes. In addition to this, most peasants lived in small, simple houses composed of only 1 or 2 rooms. Peasants ate vegetables, meat such as pork, and dark, coarse bread made from wheat mixed with rye or oatmeal. All right, so a few things we learned about over the last 2 podcasts. You guys learned about life during feudal times, the fall of the Roman Empire, which led to a period of uncertainty and danger. Europeans developed the system of feudalism to help provide economic and social stability and safety.
All right, so we were going to talk. We just were talking about knights and peasants. So below the lords are the knights, heavily armored warriors on horseback who provided service in war in return for land and protection. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were free peasants, followed by serfs. Peasants farmed the land and made most of the necessary articles of life, and serfs were peasants who were bound to the land.
All right, and right before that, we learned about monarchs and lords. They were the higher end of the social structure. So at the top of the feudal social structure was the monarch. Below the monarch were his vassals, the lords or nobles. Monarchs and nobles oversaw their lands and the people who worked them. They lived in manor houses or castles.
All right, and then overall, you guys, the system we learned about was feudalism. The feudal system arose as a way of protecting property and creating stability. It was based on loyalty and personal relationships. Monarchs gave fiefs to lords, their most important vassals. In exchange, vassals promised to supply monarchs with soldiers in war. And you guys remember we did this in class, right? Where we had a monarch and everybody got their fiefdom. So we've kind of played out what life was like in feudal Europe.
And just like there, and we talked about this before, if you didn't get a job that you liked, if you weren't born into it, you kind of stuck with that.
Exactly, for life.
Yeah, so just a reminder, we're going to spin the wheel pretty soon, and you guys will have a lesson quiz on both this podcast and the one previous to it.
I believe in you guys.
Have a nice day.